Hello, and thank you for joining us for the top talent hiding in plain sight, how to source, evaluate, and hire the amazing non-traditional candidates your competitors ignore. This program is part of the SHRM webcast series. You can learn about upcoming and on-demand events from our e-newsletters and the webcast homepage at shrm.org/webcast. SHRM thanks Wonderlic for sponsoring this program and our series of free webcasts for the HR community. Today's program will take a hard look at the underrepresented candidate groups not getting a fair shake in the current job market. You're going to hear simple strategies you can use to source, reliably assess, and hire non-traditional candidates with the highest potential to succeed. Leading our program today, we are pleased to welcome Becca, Callahan, and Jessica Haig from Wonderlic. With introductions complete, I'm pleased now to turn over the webcast microphone to Becca Callahan.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. Hi, everyone. My name is Becca Callahan. I'm the CEO of Wonderlic, and I'm so happy for the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you today about an HR challenge that is so near and dear to my heart: how to create a world where every person, regardless of their background or experience, is able to find their best job and meet their potential. Since the beginning of my career in the pre-employment assessment space, I have been committed to creating innovative approaches to solving talent problems. And I'm a big supporter of progressive approaches to recruiting, talent assessment, and really just work in general. That's why, with the support of my leadership team, I switched Wonderlic to a 32-hour, 4-day work week soon after becoming CEO in September. And when I am not in work mode, I like to hang out with my husband and my 1-year-old daughter, Mara, and check out all the great restaurants here in Chicago.
And hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Haig, and I'm thrilled to be joining Becca on this webinar. I currently lead our consulting practice as the Senior Manager of Consulting, which means my team and I partner with our thousands of clients to help ensure they're meeting their hiring goals by sharing selection best practices and measuring the impact of our solutions. I've been working in the selection and assessment space for over a decade. My educational background is in industrial organizational psychology, which is really just the science of people at work. At Wonderlic, we use this science to help companies make better, more informed hiring decisions. Like Becca, I'm a committed advocate for more inclusive workplace practices, and I'm currently working on initiatives internally and externally to support inclusion and belonging in the workplace. And when I'm not at work, I love traveling with my husband and 2 kids. And I'll turn it back over to Becca.
Perfect. So before we get going, I really just want to start out by saying the reason that we decided to do this webinar is because, as we all know, and as we're all experiencing right now, the talent market is very tight. And because of the close relationships that we have with our thousands of HR clients and the research that we are constantly doing into how to find the best people for every job, we think that we have a unique perspective on how companies can find and hire the best non-traditional candidates out there who are looking for a new job. Over the past 6 months, the job market has moved around so much, and it's really been difficult to figure out what's going on. On the one hand, there have been a huge number of people quitting their jobs for a variety of reasons. In the last 3 months that we have data for, which is really August through September, 12.7 million people, July through September, 12.7 million people quit their jobs, representing more than 8% of the workforce. And on top of that, according to an October Resume Builder poll, about 15% of the workforce plans to quit their jobs before January of 22. And if you're looking deeper into 22, Gartner Research estimates turnover could be as high as 40% in the next 12 months, especially if the expected 7% of employees quit if a vaccine mandate goes into effect. At the same time as this great resignation has been happening, hiring has been steadily increasing. In fact, U.S. job openings set records every month, January through July of 2021. And open positions soared to an incredible 10.4 million as of August 2021. And the latest employment report from the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows us that employers added 531,000 new jobs in October, bringing the unemployment rate down to a new pandemic-era low. As we all know, and as many of you are probably experiencing firsthand, maybe even when it comes to roles within your own HR department, these talent challenges can easily lead to a vicious cycle. When a lot of people quit, productivity and morale can take a hit because the people who stayed are often asked to take on more of the burden as the vacancies pile up. And when that happens, they're often more likely to feel unhappy, less motivated, and decide to look for something less stressful. This means that your company now has to backfill both the first wave of people quitting and the second wave as well. And when there's this domino effect, it is very easy for panic to set in and for HR teams to really rush hiring decisions and fill vacancies with less than optimal talent. What's become very clear to a lot of companies, including us here at Wonderlic and many of our clients, is that attitudes and hiring approaches from pre-2020 are not enough to help you solve problems in 2021 and 2022. Or put another way, these days, sticking with what feels safe really isn't safe at all. However, the challenge that so many companies are facing is also really a huge opportunity, we think, to break out of old and really unproductive habits. Now really is the perfect time to tap into the talent of many candidates that you might not have seriously considered or targeted before. And even more importantly, to evaluate their potential in more fair and effective ways. And it really boils down to this. The employers that evolve their hiring approaches will really emerge as leaders in talent acquisition and be seen as employers of choice, not only by their current employees, but by job seekers as well. And the employers that resist change or only make surface level changes or lip service changes are really vulnerable to being left behind. So, how can you avoid being left behind in this great battle for talent? And also, more importantly, in building a very diverse and high potential workforce, which is really what we all want. First, and we'll talk about these extensively, consider non-traditional and underrepresented talent pools more seriously and find new ways to reach and appeal to them. Second, take a closer look at the way you're evaluating the potential and the competencies of these candidates, making sure you're focusing on the most meaningful information and reducing unwanted bias. And third, after you've brought these candidates on board, be strategic about how you want to keep them feeling engaged and valued as they transition into what might be a new kind of work experience or environment for them. Because as we all know, retention is a recruiting tactic as well. How to practically put this kind of plan together and why it's absolutely worth the effort is really what our presentation is about today. So we're excited to talk more about this.
Awesome. Thank you, Becca. Before we dive into tactics for sourcing untapped talent, let's get specific about what's most troublesome about some traditional hiring practices and who we mean when we're talking about non-traditional or underrepresented candidates. If you're a recruiter or a hiring manager, you're looking for two things from almost every candidate in almost every role. A, you're looking for evidence the candidate has demonstrated the skills and or competencies necessary to meet expectations in the role pretty quickly. And B, you're looking for evidence that they also have the potential to grow, learn, and adapt to changing business needs. In other words, answers to what have you done that'll prepare you to hit the ground running, and what are you likely to do once you're here? If you're in talent acquisition especially, you also know that the problem with a lot of the evidence that's often used to gauge whether a person meets the perfect candidate description is problematic. Take the work history found on resumes. I'll be very blunt. Resumes aren't just unreliable indicators, they're often bad indicators as well. We all know people who have embellished things about their work histories. In fact, in one recent poll, almost 80% of candidates admitted they had or would consider misrepresenting themselves on their application. And as we also know, though probably don't admit as often, tenure isn't necessarily a measure of expertise. Often, tenure is nothing more than a mark of privilege and access to opportunity and support within a particular organization. For example, John, who's been with the company for 15 years and been promoted twice, might have been hired because he went to the same school as the hiring manager and been promoted because he was good at navigating internal politics, not because he was good at his job. As applied psychologist Tomas Chamorro-Premusic pointed out in his book, Why Do So Many Incompetent Men Become Leaders and How to Fix It, It happens all the time. If you're thinking of someone specific from your career who fits this description, I'm confident you're not alone. There are also big problems with using educational background as evidence of competence. In fact, in many recent years, many HR pros have begun campaigning to drop degree requirements from job postings for just about anything beyond hyper-specialized roles, such as engineering or medicine or law. But when they propose this change internally, they get pushback from hiring managers and others who are concerned that doing so will automatically lead to less qualified hires. Research shows this concern to be overblown, though. According to a report by McKinsey and the nonprofit Opportunity at Work, a whopping 30 million U.S. workers without college diplomas have the skills necessary to earn 70% more than they do currently. Implied in that statistic, of course, is that they could be contributing a lot more if only wary employees gave them a chance. Fortunately, a number of the country's most successful employers are already starting to remove their arbitrary four-year degree requirements for many roles. In an effort to tap the talent of this huge, underutilized talent pool, it is a very encouraging trend. And lastly, there's the tricky problem of culture fit. Hiring people who are going to succeed within your company's particular culture is obviously something to strive for. It's the unintentionally biased way that companies often approach that challenge that leads to problems. Put simply, there's an ideal way and a less than ideal way to evaluate culture fit. The ideal way is to make sure the criteria for culture fit is centered on the observable, measurable competencies or behaviors you and your hiring managers know are critical for performance in roles at your organization. Foundational behavioral competencies like curiosity or desire to learn, a high degree of customer focus, or even achievement orientation drive performance across many roles. If you're clear on the criteria, you can find both find people who are more likely to succeed and be engaged on the job, and also be confident you're being fair and consistent in your hiring practices. If you're not using clear criteria like that, if your managers would say, "I know it when I see it," well then, you're reducing your odds of finding the right person and increasing your odds of tarnishing the candidate experience. In particular, your hiring managers are leaving themselves wide open to being swayed by affinity bias, or the tendency to favor people who we have a connection to or feel similar to, like John and the fellow college alum who hired him, and less favorably towards people who don't. Evaluating culture fit in this casual, biased way won't just harm your DE&I efforts, but it could significantly impact the performance of your organization. Because as much research in the past few decades has pointed out, diverse teams generally outperform non-diverse teams. Luckily, management training focused on inclusive behaviors and coaching can help reverse this mindset. But often it takes a lot of work on the part of HR teams to push for these changes. Now, if you're a 35-year-old white, heterosexual, cisgender male with an Ivy League degree and a load of great college or family connections, you're generally going to fare pretty well in this system because it was built by people like you for people like you. But if you have a less traditional quote-unquote educational background or work history, or if you're someone from an underutilized or historically disadvantaged group, you may have a harder time proving your worth, even if you're twice as competent as the gentleman on that slide. There are many types of employees that fall into this category beyond the 30 million workers without college degrees I mentioned before. And I think it's important we name a few of them here now to remind ourselves of those groups who face unfair hurdles at every stage of the hiring process and what the negative impact of overlooking them really is.
Thanks, Jess. So we'll start with a few groups here. First, it's a sad fact that people who identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color suffer from significant systemic disadvantages in the United States. One of the ways that these systemic inequities are reflected are in the disparities in unemployment between many of these groups and whites. As a country, while we are making some strides towards improving these numbers, we have a long way to go. Also, in many cases, once these candidates are employed, they often have fewer opportunities to develop and advance and are less likely to hold positions of power and influence because of problematic structural processes and biases that exist in many organizations. This reality is depicted well in this image that has gone viral on social media lately that both Jess and I appreciated. Another often disadvantaged group are workers nearing retirement. According to a Forbes article, workers nearing retirement were dramatically impacted by the pandemic. As of the start of this year, there were 2 million fewer workers over the age of 55 than there were before the pandemic. Often, when these workers try to start somewhere else, they're victims of false assumptions about being creatures of old habits. But as age bias expert Joe Weech points out, the opposite of this false narrative is actually true. According to a recent Dropbox survey, older workers use almost the same amount of technology options as their 18 to 34-year-old counterparts. Many older workers are in fact very good at learning new things on the job since they've had to do that over and over again in their careers. And as we know well here at Wonderlic, the best indicator of ability to learn is not age or tenure, but overall cognitive ability. Also, many people late in their careers who might be passed over for being overqualified are intentionally not pursuing higher profile jobs in favor of work that allows them to learn new things and to grow. So if your hiring managers are stereotyping older workers, not only are they being biased, but they're also turning away potentially high value talent that other smarter companies will snap up. Another underutilized talent pool are people with seen and unseen disabilities. The unemployment rate for this group is 11%, which is twice the national average, and they too are impacted by false assumptions about potential regarding their diverse abilities. Again, as disabilities advocates note, these impressions fly directly in the face of reality. In fact, an Accenture study found that companies that hire people with disabilities outperform their counterparts 2-to-1 in net income. And when it comes to the question of retention, a Department of Labor study actually found that companies that hire people with disabilities see a 90% improvement in retention rate.
People with neurodivergence, which includes people with autism or an ASD disorder, ADHD, dyslexia, and among other diagnoses, are yet another underutilized labor pool. In fact, Ernst & Young Global Research found that neurodivergent people make up about 20% of the population, but face an unemployment rate of around 85%. This isn't only unfortunate, but unjust, because as a recent report by the Institute of Leadership Management stated, it's a common misconception that people having one of these conditions, such as dyslexia or autism, are less intelligent and less able, whereas in fact, there is no association between intelligence and neurodiversity. In fact, Ernst & Young research found that neurodivergent employees made fewer errors and were 90 to 140% more productive than neurotypical employees. Also interesting is that the 4 largest U.S. autism hiring programs all have retention rates of more than 90%, higher than the average retention rates in their industries. And when it comes to employees with an ADHD diagnosis, the very real challenges that they face at work can be made easier to handle by implementing measures like more structured meetings and more focused heads down time that benefit not only them, but your entire organization. Lastly, since the pandemic has created new roadblocks for many women, which could have long-lasting effects, I feel it's important to touch on women as a group as well. As of December 2019, 50% of jobs were held by women, a slim majority. But then, from February 2020 to February 2021, 2.4 million women dropped out of the labor force, whereas during the same time period, only 1.8 million men left the workforce, 25% fewer than women. Yes, many of these women have gone back to work, but there's still an imbalance. Men have returned to work at a higher rate than women, and women are still leaving in droves. Just in September of this year, 865,000 women left the labor force, 4 times more than men. Because of all this movement, we currently have 1.8 million fewer working women than we did before the pandemic began. So as we're creating hiring strategies, it's important that we think about the reasons many of these women aren't working that are out of their control and look for more ways to create space for their return. For example, by pushing for even more work schedule flexibility, whether that means asynchronous work schedules or shorter work weeks.
Thank you, Jess. So, like it or not, this is the state of things here in 2021, and we're only a month away from the new year. And while I am definitely convinced that a lot can be done to further level the playing field, I am not going to sit here and just say that by working harder, you and your HR teams should be able to do it all by yourselves. That is definitely not fair or reasonable, and there are other larger systemic issues at play. What we really need at a high level is a number of systemic changes. For one, policies like paid parental leave and universal childcare, which are really highly nonpartisan in their support, will go a long way toward accelerating underrepresented groups in the workforce. And secondly, there really needs to be a profound change in the mindset and practices of people in the boardroom, business leaders, executives, board members, and business owners. These leaders can really enact policies and approaches within their power and their scope of control, with or without legislative or regulatory requirements. But even as we continue to fight for these systemic changes in both our personal and our professional lives, there are still many concrete ways that individual HR teams and leaders can move the needle forward within our own sphere of influence and create more diverse and successful teams. Let's dig into some of the best moves you can make right now. So, we've already touched on some of the underrepresented candidate groups out there, and there are obviously even more than those. But as you're thinking about the roles you're trying to fill, or the way your company is trying to go, consider how people from these underrepresented groups could benefit your company. Then, with your HR team and possibly your hiring managers and leaders, do some online research into sourcing channels that might more likely speak to them than your standard job ads placed in places like LinkedIn, Indeed, and Monster. I'm not saying to stop using those channels, of course not. I'm just saying don't stop there. What you'll find if you do some digging is that there are all kinds of targeted job boards out there now, and more are being created every day. Places like Jopwell, Power to Fly, and Noirify, for example, are committed to connecting diverse talent to great job opportunities. A Prey Group is a digital recruiting platform connecting women who are getting back into the workforce or pivoting careers with companies seeking diverse talent. Women Hack is a company that promotes gender equality in tech and helps people get hired at companies that are committed to diversity in the workplace. Next Billion is another good one that helps people with disabilities connect with inclusive employers in tech. In short, if you're committed to diversity, there are many recruiting-related organizations that can help lead the charge and are already eager to help. Also, and this is something that we've done, prioritize outreach to historically Black colleges and universities. Take advantage of the fact that many job fairs are still happening virtually, making it possible and even easy to reach out not only to current or recently graduated students, but also to other job seekers beyond your region as well. If you're only recruiting soon-to-be college grads at four-year colleges and universities, consider focusing on community colleges and trade schools as well, which are places that generally have a larger percentage of non-traditional students. Consider the potential of those students who don't end up graduating too. Also, don't think in terms of attending job fairs. Don't just think in terms of attending job fairs. Consider ways to build longer-term relationships with those schools and their career centers. For example, by sponsoring hackathons or offering internships, which is something that we've had success with. If you're feeling stumped on how to better recruit for certain types of entry-level positions, tap into the knowledge of people invested in those industries by reaching out to members of professional associations and membership organizations. For example, if you are looking to hire better customer support staff, maybe members of the Customer Experience Professionals Association would be useful to talk to. And lastly, getting involved with organizations that support career growth for underrepresented groups within your industry can also help you attract more candidates.
As all kinds of applied psychology research tells us, there are many positions that may seem quite different, but that at their core really require the same combination of competencies. So another thing you can consider is what industries not directly related to yours might have roles with similar transferable competencies to the jobs you're looking to fill. In other words, are there any sister industries or sister roles worth looking into? One great example is the relationship between many hospitality and retail sales roles and corporate sales, customer success, and recruiting roles. And many employers hiring for these roles have found top performers coming from a hospitality or retail sales background share many of the same competencies of top performers in these more traditional corporate roles. Listening carefully to identify problems, having a customer focus, great interpersonal skills, and a strong results orientation are all things we've found. So if your hiring managers tend to look at candidates coming out of retail as less than or unqualified, remind them to look at the competencies, not just their work history. Another group in particular that has an amazing array of highly transferable skills are military veterans, of which there are millions in the US. As this graphic shows, the skills our military members accumulate over their course of service translate well to all sorts of civilian roles in our workforce. Another way to increase your chances of landing qualified non-traditional candidates is to focus more on the competencies that matter most to job success in the role than experience and education in your job postings. Jobs require a blend of foundational competencies and technical competencies, and it's important to call out technical competencies that differentiate one job from another. You probably have some clarity about what the most relevant competencies for your roles are, but if it's not as clear as your hiring managers would want, performing a job analysis can be extremely beneficial. Once you've isolated the most important competencies, for example, critical thinking, written communication skills, or stress tolerance, reconfigure your job description to highlight these needs first. On the left here is a more traditional job posting, a requirements and history-focused ad that starts with the need for a college degree, hones in mostly on skills, and only lightly touches on competencies. On the right is a job description that more descriptively paints a picture of what the company is hoping that this person can do, wants to do, and will do on the job. Instead of talking about degree requirements or even suggested level of education, the ad really focuses on the knowledge level wished for, not where or how that knowledge was obtained. Again, of course, there are some jobs that should have education or certification requirements, like doctors, lawyers, and psychologists. We're not saying you need to get rid of that requirement entirely, just make sure that it's job specific.
Thanks, Jess. So despite the record number of active job seekers right now, as we know, passive job candidates are often the highest quality talent. According to LinkedIn, historically, around 70% of candidates are generally passive. That is, they are gainfully employed workers who aren't actively looking for a new job, but who are still open to the idea of a better opportunity. And if you want to make a positive impression on these people, many of whom are non-traditional candidates, it's critical that you focus on improving your employer brand. By this, I mean being more intentional about the experiences you provide your candidates and employees, and more strategic about how you share stories about these efforts, especially in social media venues where passive job candidates are more likely to stumble across them. Specifically, highlight the ways you create a positive candidate experience with easy application methods, quick response times, and candidate feedback reports. That's something we do here at Wonderlic, by the way, to add value to every candidate's application experience. Also, tell the stories of how your employees are treated, the kinds of work flexibility you offer, the career paths or new work challenges that are available for development. And talk about the values that your company embodies proudly and often. And don't just talk about what your mission statement is. Tell real human stories about the range of employees who embody these values. And lastly, stay hyper-focused on creating a work culture that's not just diverse, but that is truly inclusive. Because the more inclusive your culture is, the more talented and underrepresented team members are going to want to be there. Recently, Linkage, an organization focused on progressive hiring and leadership, put out a white paper called The Hard Truth About Inclusion in the Workplace that identified 55 drivers of inclusion. Of these many drivers, they identified 3 that had the most meaningful impact on a sense of inclusion. The first is conducting inclusive meetings across the organization. Also, having executives that are fair, equitable, and welcoming. And third, having managers who understand, value, and look to build on team members' unique strengths. So as you're taking stock and prioritizing, keep these in mind. And in terms of how to communicate about these efforts, as I mentioned earlier, social media is the natural venue for reaching passive candidates. But you should also add this content to your website to reach those passive candidates who you may have reached out to, but who are sizing you up online. And then once those candidates are officially in your funnel, encourage your fellow recruiters and hiring managers to reiterate these values in pre-screens and interviews when answering questions about your company's culture. Okay, so now that we've covered some approaches to finding new types of candidates, let's talk about how to fairly evaluate them once they're in your funnel, a part of the process that's even more crucial to your success. The most fair and effective way to identify candidates most likely to succeed in a role is to assess them in a way that's hyper-focused on how their competencies are related to a specific job. The more effectively you do that, the happier your existing employees and managers will be because they will have great coworkers making their teams better. Here are a few ways that you can make that you can be more fair and effective.
All right. So if you're not already, consider using a recruitment CRM to send customized messages to candidates at various touch points in their application and interview process at scale. This will make them feel more valued as they have a human element to the process. Think about your existing talent network and lightweight ways to keep them engaged. In particular, keep these candidates warm by sharing stories or news about your company. Doing so will make reaching out to them about other roles more effective. Also, if you're making changes to requirements and criteria in your job descriptions, make sure that you double check the rules you create for your ATS reflects those rules as well, or else you're obviously shooting yourself in the foot when looking for the right talent. Another way many HR pros are trying to evaluate non-traditional candidates more fairly is by pushing back against outdated practices that automatically downgrade candidates for significant gaps in their work history and/or stretches where they mostly did gig work. As we understand now more than ever, to assume that a candidate with a gap in their work history is unreliable, unmotivated, or undesirable isn't simply unfair, it's an act of bias. Yes, of course, it's possible a candidate has been without work for a while because of issues with their competence or ability to work with others. That happens. But today, it's just as likely that they stopped working for a while because they needed to either become the primary caregiver for a dependent relative, like an aging parent or a child doing Zoom school. Or maybe after being let go from a job, they decided to take time off to learn a new skill set or to prep for the next phase of their career, whether through taking courses or volunteering. Or maybe they just took a much needed mental health break, as so many of us desperately need these days. In the same way, as more and more people participate in the gig economy, either to make ends meet or because their lives require the flexibility, it's unwise to consider temporary or project work as less than desirable than full-time work. Really, the only way you're going to be able to make a smart decision about a candidate with work gaps and gig work on their resume is to ask them to tell you their story. and to be open to the ways those experiences might actually have helped prepare them for the job they're applying for. And to put it bluntly, if you're out there talking about the work-life balance and mental health benefits you offer your employees, you absolutely should be considerate of work-life and mental health issues when they turn up with your candidates as well. If you don't, you're not being consistent with your company's values.
Thanks, Jess. Cover letters are obviously an opportunity for candidates to clarify the story of their career and why their unusual path has led them to you. For non-traditional candidates applying for more professional roles especially, getting the chance to connect the dots in their own way reduces their chances of getting tossed aside in the screening process. So if you phased out cover letters formally or informally to improve your speed to hire, consider the downsides of taking away that forum. And if you do still review cover letters, consider adding language to job descriptions specifically, inviting candidates without a typical education or experience to make their case there. Having said that, be thoughtful about the instances in which requiring a cover letter isn't useful or even that fair. For many entry-level roles, for example, requiring a cover letter may be a barrier to application, and there are significant differences in support and preparation offered on matters of writing a cover letter or putting together a resume for that matter between people who went to a college with a career center and people who did not. Once you've expanded your talent pools, tapped into new candidate sources, and eliminated some of the top-end obstacles that keep qualified candidates from advancing, it's now really important to objectively measure their potential for success with pre-employment assessment, a subject that both Jess and I are obviously very familiar with. One of the upsides to including this step is that unlike the subjective information that often comes out of an interview, pre-employment assessments provide candidate data that's objective and consistent. Unlike a resume, which only explains where they've been and what they've done, you can identify a candidate's stable attributes, like their ability to learn and solve problems, how they might act as part of a team, and what drives them, and their overall potential for success. With these types of insights, companies are often able to uncover talent that they may have overlooked if they'd only considered work history, references, and education. If you go down this path, make sure that your choice of assessment tool ticks a few very important boxes. First, its design should be developed by IO psychologists who follow legal and ethical best practices and found to be both valid and reliable. If a test is valid, it measures what it's supposed to measure, and what it's measuring helps us learn something that will actually predict success. If it's reliable, the results are consistent over time. In other words, it's a test that someone would score the same on whether they just took the test today or a few months from now. Additionally, the use of assessment absolutely has to be related to job and business requirements. This is non-negotiable. In other words, the results should prescribe who has the potential relative to a specific job's requirements, as opposed to giving you blanket feedback about the cognitive ability, personality, or motivation of a person in general. If the test you're considering wasn't developed for hiring specifically, then you absolutely shouldn't be using it as a measure of job fit in your selection process. Beyond those two very basic requirements, it's also a good idea to look at the research out there about which types of assessments have been shown to be most predictive of job performance. What decades of research consistently shows is that cognitive ability is the single best predictor of performance. And by cognitive ability, we mean the ability to do things like problem solve, learn from training and experiences, and adapt to new situations. What's also clear from the research is that more distinct predictors help predict performance. More specifically, adding a layer of other valid predictors like personality and motivation creates what's known as incremental validity and can give you even more confidence about the decisions you're making. We designed OneScore, our flagship digital assessment, to be a multi-measure test that leverages the powerful combination of cognitive ability, personality, and motivation in large part because of these findings. We want to give HR teams a reliable way to identify what a candidate can do, their cognitive ability, what they want to do, their motivation, and what they likely will do, which is their personality. Also, one of the things we prioritize very highly was making sure the results are very easy to read and act on, because HR teams have enough things they're expected to be experts in. Interpreting a wide range of assessments should not be one of them. So we kept it simple. Every candidate takes the same test, but their scores depend on the job profile or the role they applied for. For example, the responses someone provided might yield a very high score for a software engineer role, but only a moderate score for a sales associate role, which makes sense because the high priority competencies we keep talking about are different for those two jobs. Also, having only one set of core assessments but millions of differentiated job profiles makes it easy for HR teams and hiring managers to look at candidates that maybe applied for one role and aren't a good fit, but show signs for being a good fit somewhere else. And lastly, to make things even easier for HR teams trying to evaluate talent, we recently took the guesswork out of matching a job to existing job profiles. Other assessment companies generally work with less than 100 off-the-shelf job profiles. At Wonderlic, we've developed a database based on advances in machine learning that now contain more than 3.5 million unique job titles, each of which has its own job profile explaining the competencies and behaviors that are most desirable for the role. This has really been a 20-year effort on our part. We spent 10 years creating just 1,000 job profiles off the shelf, leveraging ONET, and have focused relentlessly on adding to that over time. So our customers can have access to what predicts performance in specific jobs totally off the shelf with no overhead or customization requirement. One of our most recent expansions to this multi-year, multi-million-dollar investment in both artificial intelligence and IO psychology has given us the ability to offer our customers access to 3.5 million jobs off the shelf, so they can rest assured that the nuanced and specific performance attributes for their job, whether it's about the role or the industry, are accounted for. What this means for hiring managers is that they don't have to use profiles that sort of match the job they're hiring for or go through an onerous consultation process. If the job exists, we now have a profile for it. As you can imagine, with this unique 360-degree view of candidates and what they're capable of, companies are much more likely to identify the potential in candidates they might not typically take a close look at and hire them with confidence. This actually happened not long ago with one of our customers, a manager named Chip Elliott, who runs an auto center in Michigan. I could tell the story myself, but I'll just play a short clip instead.
Kind of a cool story is that I had a woman apply for a business development center position, a BDR. And she came in and I had her take the test. She, killed it. Cognitive ability was really high. Personality, motivation was all high. She came in and I did an interview with her and she didn't fit our initial mold. Typically, when we're looking for finance managers, we like to recruit right out of college or really soon past college with like a finance degree and things like that. She happened to be an older woman that had some experience in the banking world as, a teller. After I did the interview and the test and everything, I ended up hiring her as a finance manager. A lot of that had to do with the testing that she took, and it worked out. She's been with us for 2+ years now, and one of our best finance managers, probably top 20% in the group.
I always love hearing that story and stories like that from our clients. So thanks, Becca, for playing that. Last but not least, we wanted to touch on onboarding non-traditional candidates before we finish here. These days, especially, a good retention strategy is as valuable as a good recruiting strategy, or really it should be considered part of your overall recruiting strategy. Because as you all know well, getting great talent in the door is one thing, getting them to stay and to be engaged and productive is quite another. That's why in this strange hiring environment, especially where people are quitting in droves and many people start a job without meeting their team in person, and where it's easier to bounce from one remote job to another, it's more crucial than ever to take onboarding seriously. The stats really bear this out. A 2018 JobVite study found that 33% of job seekers have left a position in the first 90 days, which is pretty scary, especially all the effort you put into that. However, an effective onboarding program can improve your employee retention by up to 82%. And it helps employees be more successful long-term too. According to a Kronos study, 77% of employees who had a formal onboarding process hit their performance goals in their first year. So what are a few things to keep in mind as you're onboarding people, especially in this era of the Great Resignation? I'll leave you with 2. 1, aim to tailor your onboarding to the needs of individuals as much as possible. Some hiring assessments can actually help you zero in on the learning potential for different candidates to make that easier for you. For example, a feature of OneScore called New Hire Success Tips, which is available once someone's marked as hired, helps answers questions like, does a candidate prefer learning in part of a group or in a one-on-one setting? And do they generally need a lot of support from their manager or supervisor or not? The more you understand the unique strengths and traits of your new hires, whether from your hiring assessment or by simply asking them about their preferences at the start of onboarding, the better. And second, equally important to formal onboarding is assigning new hires a mentor whenever possible. Studies show that over time, mentoring programs reduce turnover and can lead to more diverse teams. The impact is substantial. 94% of employees say they would stay with their employer longer if they had opportunities to learn and grow, and that's exactly what an effective mentoring program offers. Also, it's really important who you pair up with your new hire. In a great new book called The End of Bias, A Beginning, author Jessica Nordell shares a number of examples of university studies involving women engineering majors. When they were paired with male mentors or no mentors at all, feelings of belonging and confidence dropped, and many of those women switched majors in their first year. However, of the female students with female mentors, 100% of them stayed in their program. Does this mean only pair men with men and women with women? Of course not. But thinking about the life experience of the mentor and mentee carefully will help you make smarter decisions about who to pair with who.
Thanks, Jess. No doubt the challenge of both filling open roles and creating a more diverse workforce in the process is not easy, but continuing to fight for a more level playing field and being strategic in your approach is the best way forward. And as we all adjust our thinking on what evidence of competencies really matters and what doesn't, and start opening our minds to new ways of gauging and utilizing talent, I think we need to always remember we're not doing non-traditional candidates a favor by taking a chance on them. If they have the skills your teams really need and the potential to be successful in the role, they're the ones who are doing us a huge favor by deciding to choose us and use their talents to help us reach our goals. If we're going to change the way we assess and hire people, I think we need to keep that front of mind no matter what. Anyway, that's all we've got for you today, but we're constantly thinking about new ways to tap into underrepresented talent pools. So if you're curious to hear more, feel free to follow me and Jess on LinkedIn or just drop us a note. And if you're interested in learning more about how to leverage assessment to find the best possible workers out there, we'll be sending you a link to a guide we created recently that digs more into what we look for and how to best use assessments. Thanks so much for showing up today, and we're happy to take questions if you have them.
We will turn to audience questions in just a moment. SHRM thanks Wonderlic for sponsoring this program and our series of free webcasts. Wonderlic's pre-employment assessments help thousands of employers identify candidates with the most potential to become top performers in their organization. To learn more or to schedule a free demo, please visit Wonderlic.com. All right, and let's turn to some of the questions coming in. We'll start here. We've got a viewer who asks, I'm in recruiting and I've made the case for best practices like assessment and more structured interviews, but most of the hiring managers at my company and our president still like to do things old school. What's a good way to make the case for changing that?
That's a fantastic question. This is something that we talk to our clients about all the time. This is an area where I think really sustained advocacy matters a lot. And the more it can be evidence-based, the better. So our recommendation to our clients is really just continue to get in front of those business leaders and hiring managers with evidence. And there's all kinds of studies, third-party evidence, all kinds of white papers out there. We have some we can offer as well, but there's all kinds to really show why more structured practices, more objective practices, more evidence-based practices are going to get you better outcomes. It's going to get you better performers on the job, which is ultimately something that resonates with all business leaders and hiring managers. It's just a matter of getting the rationale in front of them enough to provoke a change in behavior. So this is something that we think requires a ton of internal influence, a ton of internal communication. And I am oftentimes surprised at what's the thing that really tips the scales. So my general advice is keep advocating and keep trying, and try to keep getting that evidence in front of those key decision makers.
Another question from our audience. Viewer asked, to what degree do you recommend companies weigh assessment results against, for example, what they see in a resume or in an interview?
I'll go ahead and jump in and take that one, Becca. So there's a lot of research on this, actually like decades and decades of research on this, where some of the applied psychologists within the IO field have looked at the difference in how well specific tools predict performance on the job. And the culmination of that research, which is, like I said, decades of research at this point, is really that valid, reliable, professionally developed assessments are the best predictor. Especially those that include cognitive ability, whereas things like a traditional interview are a little bit more effective than flipping a coin. So I would say I would put more weight on those objective measures, such as the assessments, if you have a valid, reliable, professionally developed job-specific tool, rather than putting as much weight into an interview or a resume. They really are just the signals that people want to place in front of you and as they put their best foot forward. So they're more subjective. They're definitely filtered presentations of how the person performs. Some people get coaching on resumes, some don't. So that also disadvantages certain populations as well. So I would, if I had to rank it, definitely put assessments first, probably followed by well-developed structured interviews, and then finally resumes last. If I had to rank it, that would be our recommendation for best practice.
All right, and we'll close with this question. Actually, a couple of folks asking about this. You mentioned that you started a 4-day work week at your company. How is that going so far? We'd love to try it too, but I think management may be wary.
Yeah, that's a great question. This has been very exciting for us. So a couple of things, I think, when it comes to influencing senior management on this, because it is a big mindset shift, right? Like there are kind of older ways of looking at productivity and performance. And some organizations can see that as things that are very transactional, like, basically butts in seats, like the number of hours that you spend in front of your screen. That's where a lot of this kind of this new trend of like employee surveillance software is coming in, where people are looking at how often are people moving their mouse, how much are they typing, how many clicks do they have on their screen. This is a really transactional way of looking at performance. And so the real mindset shift that needs to happen is to look at outcomes. There are much better metrics of productivity than how many hours someone is spending behind a screen. And so I think, a couple of key things that are helpful here. One is that there are a ton of studies coming out about this. I think at least one from Iceland, one from New Zealand, a couple of other countries as well, where there are really, really meaningful measures of sustained or increased productivity by going down to a 32-hour, 4-day work week. Another option, and this is what we did, is to run a pilot. We ran a test this summer, and what we found is that on our own most important productivity metrics, on our own most important outcome metrics, we were able to sustain or increase performance. And in addition to that, we were also able to increase our employee engagement scores and make some improvements on employee retention as well during a time when most firms are losing a record number of employees. So that test really kind of helped us understand that this was something that we could sustain long term. So I would say, again, bringing some of that evidence to senior management that it may very well be worth trying. And we all know the cost of turnover, right? Like we know how egregiously expensive it is to replace valuable people. So I think there's a really kind of tempting thing there that could be worth pursuing, and hopefully enough to provoke interest. And then we would definitely recommend running a pilot. Maybe that's something, if you're a larger organization, you only do with a certain geography or a certain department or business unit. But it's something that you can really test out yourself and see what outcomes you get. But for us, it's been highly favorable across the board. And we're seeing a lot of other technology organizations who are kind of beginning the process around when we did and are getting the same results. So definitely something we would recommend. But it is definitely a mindset shift for senior management.
All right, thank you. We are coming to the end of our program. Before we sign off, we want to thank Becca Callahan and Jessica Haig from Wonderlic for the insight and information they provided today. And we want to thank everyone tuning in for being with us and for choosing SHRM for HR Webcast. That concludes this program.